Being in the Fire Emblem fandom, especially witnessing a lot of Three Houses versus Engage debates, I see a lot of arguments about whether gameplay or story is more important. And I realize that generally people are talking about cutscenes versus the strategic on-map gameplay of the series, but the framing of the argument as story versus gameplay has always irked me a little bit, because to me, gameplay and story are complementary. We can create meaning from gameplay, and when games are at their best, gameplay enhances and can even be storytelling. Fire Emblem is often pretty good at this. Before I explain what I mean by that, though, a big thank you to my patrons: Helix, Aikipu, Lucy, Sev, Van West, Acrobatic Jazz, A Family of Trees, Romeo, Tim Straight, Aaron Gedden, Emma, and Zakar. I really appreciate your support. If you want to get early access to videos, shoutouts in videos, and have access to polls that influence the content schedule, you'll find a link in the video description. Okay, so let's get into how gameplay can contribute to or even be storytelling. Usually I only talk about Fire Emblem on this channel, but I want to start with a more simple game, Pong. There's no cutscenes or dialogue in Pong, we don't even really have characters. But there is a story being told. That being that we're playing a game of tennis. The story is told slightly through the aesthetic, the line in the middle representing a net and the object they're bouncing back and forth representing a ball. But more importantly, we know it's a tennis game because of the mechanics. We're bouncing a ball back and forth, and you win a point by getting the ball past your opponent's paddle. That's tennis. And our understanding of game mechanics allows us to make meanings of these lines and dots so that we can understand that. So we can generate some basic meaning from gameplay mechanics alone, especially when you combine them with aesthetics, but what's more, gameplay mechanics allow narratives to emerge. In Pong, a comeback victory, a blowout win, and a competitive game all evoke different emotions in the players and create a different story for each game. And this is basically true of all games. You can even see this in real-life sports. Team identities, rivalries, and the story of each game are all influenced by the mechanics of the sport and how they're interacted with by the players, and this creates narratives. The storytelling of games in competition is so powerful that professional wrestling has made an entire medium out of creating stories within the constraints of fictional competition. Even in this totally fictional setting, the rules of the competition influence the story being told. We can take different meaning and understanding from a steel cage match versus a regular wrestling match based solely on how the mechanics work, before we even get into the wrestlers participating or what the storyline has been leading up to this match. That we can derive meaning and experience emotions based on gameplay mechanics and rules and interactions with those gameplay mechanics and rules means that developers can use these things to create or enhance a story. We can look at something a bit more modern than Pong to show what I mean. Permadeath in Fire Emblem is a design choice that we can derive meaning from. Part of what creates the sensation of Fire Emblem games being a game about war and its consequences is that people can die. This doesn't just create tension during gameplay, it's also something Fire Emblem has to say about the nature of war, that characters we love, good people that we've gotten to know, can be lost to it, and that the war will continue on as if nothing happened. Fire Emblem actually makes this point to me more strongly even than games with better writing, because it's something Fire Emblem allows you to experience, while many other games make points about death or the nature of war specifically through cutscenes. The consequence of death is always looming in Fire Emblem, and when it happens, you feel the result in gameplay, and that makes it hit harder. Staying on the topic of permadeath, even game over conditions or units that can't die can still serve storytelling. Why are other units expendable but Marth isn't in FE1? Well, this is because Marth is special. He's the chosen one to wield the falchion, and he's the inspiration for so many in the army. Even without getting into the dialogue and cutscenes, we feel this through gameplay because if Marth dies, the army falls apart. That's not true for anybody else. Marth being special is also reinforced through play with his access to specific weapons, as well as him being the only unit that can go visit villages. Plus, enemies are magnetically attracted to attacking Marth whenever they can. So the game doesn't just tell us that Marth is special, this is reinforced through gameplay. He feels unique and special compared to other units in your army. Being able to create meaning through gameplay like this was particularly important in Marth's first game since there were more limitations on how much dialogue you could even have in an NES game. Instead, the player creates narratives for units based on the events of gameplay. This was quite literally the point of early Fire Emblem games. If you go and look at old Kaga interviews, he talks about wanting players to be able to find meaning and importance in characters through play. This was the whole point of merging RPG mechanics and strategy mechanics in the way that Fire Emblem does. Another great example of storytelling through gameplay is the Trainee Units in Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones, who do a wonderful job of telling a story through gameplay and presentation. When I first started playing Sacred Stones, I fell in love with Ross, one of the Trainee Units, early on for a couple reasons. First, his unique sprite is just funny. I love seeing the little guy chuck his hatchet or clumsily swing an iron axe. But second was how fast he gained experience. These two things, coupled with his low bases and unique class, promised a zero-to-hero story. A unit that we can put some effort into and watch grow into a capable combatant. And that's largely what you get, by giving us the aesthetic of a little kid with an axe compared to the rest of our fully grown soldiers. Combined with low bases but fast EXP gain, we can easily see what this unit's story is, and that story is mostly delivered both mechanically and aesthetically. Another cool mechanical thing with the trainees is that they have by far the most diverse class options because they get to pick a branching path twice. Once when they get out of their trainee class, and once when they promote to tier 2. So while most units only have 2 possible endgame classes, trainees have 3 or more. And this also helps to sell them as young people coming of age. Their path is less set in stone and more malleable because they have more room to grow and learn. This makes perfect sense with this story, and it feels great in gameplay. If it were up to me, maybe the trainees would have been a little stronger at endgame, but the narrative they deliver works, and we can understand the training arc and payoff without a word having to be spoken. It's part of what makes them compelling. Of course, dialogue and cutscenes can also create meaning, and ideally, what we can derive from the writing in a game works hand in hand with its gameplay. In Fire Emblem, the weight of something like a character death is heavier and more meaningful the more attached you've grown to the character. So things like supports that give you more of a chance to know a character make each death hit harder. But even with just gameplay and presentation, it's very possible to become attached to characters. You can really see this in early Fire Emblem games where characters barely have any dialogue, but people still have favorites based primarily on gameplay qualities and who they invested in. There's tons of people that stand some random Kaga-era character with practically no dialogue. This is because how characters grow and what they achieve in gameplay for us starts to tell a story. Whether that be Gordon growing from a bright-eyed youngster to a capable veteran, or Jagan, a combat-ready veteran who will eventually be eclipsed by his compatriots. Through mechanics and presentation alone, there's a lot we can do to tell a unit's story. And then of course we can always add good dialogue to deepen our connection to a unit or character even more. Fire Emblem really succeeds at merging gameplay and story when it's at its best by tailoring maps to create interesting and dramatic scenarios that are influenced by what's going on in the story. Like in Three Houses' second half, where you fight some of the characters you haven't recruited during part 1. Killing these units is always the saddest part of Three Houses to me, and it's because it's done in gameplay. A character dying in a cutscene is one thing, but making you press the attack button and kill the character yourself makes it hit much harder, especially knowing that you could have saved the unit by recruiting them. Killing Ferdinand hits particularly hard in Three Houses, especially if you recruited Dorothea, as her dialogue in the monastery afterwards is brutal. This is so much more powerful than killing a generic enemy or Ferdinand being killed in a cutscene, and it's a perfect example of Fire Emblem implementing storytelling and drama into the gameplay. Implementing dramatic moments into the gameplay allows us to experience something rather than just witnessing or watching it, and it's one of the strengths of the medium. Thracia 776 is another game that does a great job of taking advantage of this. In Chapter 19, for example, Leaf makes a big mistake. Against his advisor's recommendation, he sends half his forces ahead to attack the Empire, and the next morning he finds they were overwhelmed and are retreating. Dorius, the advisor that he sent to lead the charge, even died in the attack. In many games, Leaf would wallow for a bit and then we'd move on, or maybe do a chapter where we rescue some retreating green units. But Thracia handles this in a really cool way. The next map splits your army in half, with half your units starting near the enemy, that's your retreating party, and Leaf and the rest of your army starting far away to the north by the escape point. So the game doesn't just tell you about the consequences of Leaf's mistakes, you have to experience it. You have to save half your army, and if you don't, they will die or be captured. Even better is that the game gives you some choice here. Leaf starts right next to the escape point. If you want, you can cut your losses and leave immediately, abandoning the units to the south. Alternatively, you can charge down to your southern soldiers and try to save them. There are ways to trivialize this map, particularly if you know how to manipulate deployment order, but on your first playthrough, saving everyone can be pretty tricky. You probably have some foot units down there that will have some trouble outrunning the enemy cavalry. So if you're worried about saving everyone, an attractive option can be to sacrifice a unit or two as decoys to slow down the enemy while the rest can get away. Regardless of whether you go for a no man left behind approach, leave a couple noble sacrifices, or just dip and leave half your army to get captured, this is so much cooler than if the game just told you what happened, because you get to experience it and you get to make choices about how you want to handle it. And importantly, those choices have consequences. Any unit left behind is one you're not going to have access to for a bit, and anyone that dies you won't have access to for the rest of the game. I even think this chapter retroactively makes Dorius' sacrifice that we heard about in the cutscene more interesting, because we get to see a glimpse of the situation he was in instead of just having to imagine it. Creating meaning through gameplay is actually something Thracia nails for basically the entire game, sometimes by building a chapter that allows you to experience a dramatic event in the story, like Chapter 19, but sometimes in slightly more subtle ways. In the early game of Thracia, you are a small group of fighters with no funding and no military backing, and the mechanics do a lot to reinforce this. First, you don't have any money, and the game isn't going to give you money anytime soon. Second is the way that we resolve that issue. In order to supply our soldiers, we'll have to steal from enemies or capture them and take their things. What a perfect way for a ragtag group of soldiers to equip themselves. The game doesn't just tell you you're an army scrounging for supplies, you actually have to do the scrounging yourself. Eventually, if you do a lot of stealing and capturing, your financial situation starts to look a lot better, but this feels justified because you were the one that did the work to make that happen. Additionally, in the early game, when our army is at its weakest and being chased by a much stronger force, we spend a lot of time running away. There's a lot of escape maps and strong reinforcements that chase us towards the escape point, and it really makes the gameplay feel in line with what's happening in the narrative. When games integrate the gameplay with the story well, it makes both more fulfilling, even when one of them isn't the best. Three Houses doesn't have my favorite gameplay in the series, but the chapters where you have to fight a student still hit pretty hard. Engage doesn't have my favorite story in the series, but the maps where the gameplay conforms to the narrative are the ones where the story is most memorable to me. The best example of this is Chapter 11 of Engage, where your emblem rings and draconic time crystal have been stolen from you. Even though the cutscene for me did not evoke many strong emotions, the loss of the rings and the removal of the time crystal at the beginning of the chapter create a feeling of dread, hopelessness, and vulnerability. To me, Vale feels so much more threatening during this map when she's stealing rings and bestowing them upon her allies than she does at any other point in the game. By representing the events of the story in the gameplay, Engage was able to get me to feel what the story wanted me to feel, even though the cutscene didn't work for me. And this made that chapter one of the most memorable in the game. A smaller example of Engage doing this well is in Chapter 18. In the cutscene prior to the chapter, you're told that no one is left alive in the town. However, when you start the chapter, you notice there are actually 2 villages on the map. My initial thought when I saw this was, oh, I guess the town isn't actually empty, that's weird. But when you finally visit the villages, instead of a living person handing you an item, a bunch of the corrupted jump out of the village to fight you. This is a cool subversion of expectations, and it doesn't feel like a gotcha because, hey, the game literally told you there was no one alive here, so what did you expect? Beyond these examples, there are all sorts of little mechanical things that provide additional context and meaning in Fire Emblem. The sacred weapons being effective against monsters in FE8 makes them feel like holy weapons. A unit's stats define what a character can do and influence how their capability will be perceived by the player. Growths tell us about a character's aptitudes and potential for improving. I've mostly been talking about gameplay conforming to what's going on in the story and how we can take meaning from gameplay, but there's also opportunities for the story to react to the gameplay. We see this sometimes in Fire Emblem with things like characters reacting to other character deaths. My favorite instance of this is the scene you get with Clive if you allow Matilda to die in Shadows of Valentia. It's depressing, it feeds into Clive's doubt over choosing Alm to lead the Deliverance, and it's the consequences of your actions. I would love more little things like that in future Fire Emblem games, and it doesn't just have to be about character deaths. Slight changes in dialogue depending on how your characters have grown or how you tackled certain chapters would be neat. Something like Fogato being upset with you if you fail to save any villagers in Chapter 12 of Engage, or Lynn's sparring match with Hector in Fire Emblem 7 going differently depending on which one you've trained more. Obviously, it would be a lot of work for the story to react to every little thing that you can do in gameplay, but even just doing this sort of thing a little more often would be pretty exciting. To me, Fire Emblem is at its best when the gameplay and story are working together. It makes the most memorable maps and often some of the most inventive gameplay. Things like Escape All and Capturing, for example, are great for how they support the story, but they're also unique and fun mechanics to play with. So I hope Fire Emblem continues to seek ways to represent the story through gameplay, and in turn, seek ways for the story to react to the gameplay as well. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. If you liked it, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button so that you don't miss the next upload. And if you want to chat about Fire Emblem more, consider checking out the community Discord linked in the video description, or drop by one of the streams. Either way, thanks so much for hanging out, and have yourself a lovely week.